The guards burst into the monastery garden at midnight. One of the soldiers shouted, "Halt!" and knocked the lantern out of the hands of the insistent servant. The bishop stood by the stone fountain, his shirt unbuttoned, his hands trembling. Nearby, pressed against the stone, was a woman in a dark dress, her hand pressed to her lips, trying to breathe evenly. The guard seized them immediately. The feudal lord arrived at dawn. He passed through the gate without knocking, without a word, and looked at them as if studying the signs of illness. None of those present knew what to do first. People waited for his orders. The bishop opened his mouth, then closed it. He remained silent with the same expression he used to stand behind the pulpit. His gaze focused, his voice controlled. The woman looked at her husband. There was no pleading in her eyes. There was only a weary understanding that the secret had come out. The guards raised their torches and illuminated their faces. The faces around them were familiar. A monk, a couple of servants, an old doctor, the one who had once taught the feudal lord not to show weakness. No one made any sudden movements. At first there was silence. Then the feudal lord walked over to the fountain, took off his gloves and stared at the water for a long time without turning away. The woman sighed. "I didn't plan it," she said quietly. "It just happened." Her voice was even, showing no fear. The bishop lowered his eyes. He said, "I ask your forgiveness. I have sinned." He spoke clearly, and in his words there was both the voice of a priest and the guilt of another. The feudal lord listened silently, then raised his hand, and at that moment it became clear that he did not want public shame for his wife. He turned away and quietly ordered the guards to take them to a cell in the monastery. No one dared to question this order. The days that followed were filled with preparations, conversations, and a decision that the feudal lord made silently. He did not want to execute his wife. It was his usual gesture. To remove, control, deprive of freedom, but not destroy. He wanted people to talk about him differently. So he devised a punishment for the bishop. One of those punishments that leave a mark on people's memories and make the kingdom whisper about him. But in those early days he just watched. How the bishop sat and remained silent. How his wife wrote short letters and hid them in her hem. How the monastery discussed the minutes of the meeting. The bishop was young and thin. Before coming to this city, he was known as someone who spoke loudly in church, who accused those whose path differed of sin. He spoke harshly, and people feared his condemnation. But in personal communication, he was gentler. He kept to himself, as if afraid to show his flaws. The woman noticed this from the very first days. Her name was Maria, and she was the wife of a feudal lord with a cold gaze and strict manners. She rarely laughed. At home, she was considered reserved, but when she was alone, she seemed different. Her voice broke softly, and sometimes she looked away, as if hiding her remorse. They met for the first time at the blessing of the city. The bishop approached the stage after Mass. He spoke simply, without embellishment, and spoke at length. She stood in the crowd and did not intend to stay. But he noticed her, and began to look at her more often. He did not think about the consequences at first. It began as curiosity. She began to attend services more often than was required. They exchanged brief gestures, then words. He asked questions about her home, her husband, how she spent her days. She answered truthfully and did not try to hide anything. The first touches did not happen in the garden by the fountain, but in the monastery library. There was a room there that was less guarded. She came in like a pilgrim, with a book in her hands. He was sitting at a table teaching children to read. She approached and asked about a line. His answer took a minute, but her eyes never left him. He raised his hand to adjust a strand of hair on her forehead, and she did not pull her shoulder away. That touch was enough to change the order of things. Both felt what could not be said in church, an attraction that shook their usual way of life. They talked about simple things. "Are you afraid someone will find out?" she asked once. He looked at her and replied, "I fear for you more than for myself." She touched his hand. She said, "I never asked for freedom. I only asked that someone call me a person, not part of an estate." He was silent, then said, "I'm thinking of leaving all this behind." She laughed softly. "Where will you go, Bishop?" He lowered his head. "I don't know, but I want less hypocrisy in my life." Soon their meetings became secret and more risky. They met in the garden after lights out, when the guards returned to their barracks. They whispered, held hands, and did not look back. She sometimes cried, and he held her by the shoulders, stroking her back with his palm. He spoke of repentance, of asking God for forgiveness, but he also asked her for forgiveness. She said that forgiveness was a word that did not heal her loneliness. They talked about misfortunes, about empty feasts, meaningless court conversations, the children she did not have, and how this place held her like a thing. One day, a monk overheard their conversation and told the guards. The monk confessed, "I thought you were doing good, but when I heard you, I realized you were avoiding responsibility." The guards came at night. Maria and the bishop did not have time to hide. The feudal lord was already there at night. They saw him when a dim light was burning in the temple. He stood by the back column, his fingers crossed over his chest, and looked at them. They waited for the verdict with different thoughts. Maria thought he would kill them both. The bishop thought it was the end of his career. But the feudal lord took a step back and left silently. The feudal lord went to his house and closed the door behind him. The door slammed quietly, but there was a decision in that sound. He sat down at the table, put his gloves on his knees and stared at them for a long time without moving. He said nothing for a minute. Then he called the senior welder, and the guard who was always nearby when important decisions were made. "Have you heard what's going on at the monastery?" he asked emotionlessly. "I have," replied the guard. "The people are whispering. The rumors will reach the castle, the market, the court." The feudal lord nodded. "She cannot be executed. People will remember my wife's name and think badly of me. I need another mark. I need them to remember it. I need everyone to say, 'He paid the price.'" "Do you want to punish the bishop?" asked the welder. "Yes." The feudal lord placed his palm on the table. "But not just threaten him. I want it to be humiliating in public, so that no one can say that I am weak or unable to defend the honor of my house, so that the bishop's name is spoken as a warning." "It's risky," said the blacksmith. "The church may intervene." "I know," replied the feudal lord, "but I have my own influence. I will speak quietly with the royal court. I will find something that can be presented. And also, I will show compassion towards my wife. Let people think that I am generous. But the bishop will receive public punishment." The next day, the feudal lord began to act quietly. He sent a servant to the archbishop in a neighboring town with a letter. He invited people who could provide compromising information. Old servants who had seen the bishop at Mary's house before, people who had noticed strange gifts. No one told the whole truth, but the feudal lord pressed them so hard that the necessary words were spoken. He worked with facts and hints. The bishop sat in his cell in the monastery and waited. He asked the monk for forgiveness and read prayers, but his voice betrayed more than just words of repentance. He thought about Maria, about her hands, about her gaze. At times, he would break away from his prayers and listen to the footsteps behind the wall. They gave him time to be silent, but did not allow him to leave the monastery walls. Every day, people came, the feudal lord's emissaries, monks who wanted to know, and ordinary people who wanted to take a look. He saw the glances, heard the whispers. Mary sat in her room and wrote letters. She wrote them and immediately hid them in her hem. She knew her husband would not kill her, but she understood the price of her actions. Once, a maid came to her and said that her husband demanded that she not appear in public, so that he could show mercy. Maria looked up, smiled dryly and said, "Let him show it. I am not asking for his mercy." The maid was confused. "Vasilisa, do you want him to talk about it?" "I don't want that," Maria replied. "But he needs to show that he is in control of the situation." "I don't want that. I want it to end." The feudal lord announced a public trial. The news spread through the city like the tolling of a bell. He said that the bishop was accused of hypocrisy and corruption of minors, embezzlement of church funds, and immorality. These accusations were serious and sounded good to the simple ear. He did not speak of love and secret meetings. He accused the bishop of crimes that could justify severe punishment without discrediting the court. The bishop learned of the charges from the monk who came with the decree. He looked at the list and shook his head. "This is a lie," he said quietly. "There is no truth here." "People need the truth they can understand," replied the monk. They will not understand words about love. The bishop thought for a moment. Then he said, "Let there be a trial. I will tell the truth." The monk did not reply. He knew that sometimes the truth is worse than fiction. The hearing began. People from the surrounding lands gathered in the hall. The feudal lord's servants, monks, merchants, and peasants. The feudal lord sat in the front pew and looked at the bishop. The bishop stood and said nothing. The judge spoke loudly, listing the charges and calling witnesses. The witnesses came forward and said, "I saw the bishop going to the feudal lord's house at night. I heard him talking to a woman. He took money from the church treasury." Some lied outright, some exaggerated, some remained silent, looking at the feudal lord as the master of truth. Maria came to the trial. She entered through the side doors, her face pale. When the bishop saw her, he pressed his lips together. He wanted to say something, but held back. She sat on the last bench and did not raise her head. She answered the judge's questions briefly. "We met. I am guilty." But he did not commit any other crimes. I nodded several times, adjusting my veil. The audience noticed her apparent calmness, and this added to the gravity of the situation. The feudal lord did not speak immediately. He sat and listened to what people were saying. Then he stood up and said, "I do not want execution, but I want everyone to know that if a person uses his sacred office to deceive people, he must be stripped of his dignity and punished so that no one thinks that the church is above the law." His words sounded official. People whispered. The judge nodded and handed down his decision. The bishop would be stripped of his rank and must appear before the people without his bishop's robes, be publicly shamed, and be exiled to a remote monastery without the right to communicate with people. He was also ordered to ask for forgiveness in the square. When the sentence was pronounced, the bishop bowed his head and said quietly, "I accept. I said this not because I agree, but because I do not want her to suffer any more." Maria heard this and covered her face with her hand. Her shoulders trembled. She did not cry aloud, but her lips quivered. The feudal lord looked at them both impassively, without any visible emotion. His punishment was ready. It was to serve as an example. And the people did indeed say, "This is how those who break their vows are punished." But in the conversation about truth and punishment, no one thought about the fact that punishment can break not only those who deserve it, but also those who are close to them. The bishop stepped out into the square in the morning light. People stood close together: merchants, craftsmen, peasants, boys. On the podium, the judge repeated the sentence. The bishop stood in a simple cloak, his fingers clenched into fists. When he was ordered to remove his vestments, he took them off slowly, without a word. Someone whispered. Someone laughed. He lowered his gaze and, without raising his head, took the cross from under his clothes and handed it to the minister. The minister held the cross as if he did not know what to do with it. He was ordered to kneel in the middle of the square and utter a penitent response. The bishop knelt, and his voice trembled, but it sounded steady. "I have sinned," he said. "I ask forgiveness from God and from the people." The people listened. Some crossed themselves. Some hurled words like stones. The feudal lord sat on the podium, his face calm. At times he looked at Maria. She stood at the edge of the square, her eyes downcast. He made a gesture as if to protect her, as if he were magnanimous. The people saw this and applauded. After the official part, what the bishop feared least began. Conversations, gossip, letters to neighboring cities. The feudal lord had given orders in advance. The news of the punishment must reach the royal court itself. Envoys rode to noblemen with the story of how the hypocrite had been exposed. They spoke politely and added, "We have acted justly." Thus, rumors changed the form of the truth. The bishop was sent to a small hermitage monastery on the border of the estate. It was cold there and there were few people. He was settled in a cell without amenities. He was deprived of his right to serve and communicate with parishioners. He worked with his hands. He carried water, chopped wood, and cleaned stones from the ditches. He did his work in silence. Sometimes an old brother would come to him and whisper, "You must be patient, my son." The bishop replied dryly, "I will endure." Maria remained in the house, but her life had changed. She was no longer invited to celebrations. The servants whispered in her presence. Sometimes someone would come in, and bring her food in a silent box. She walked the corridors, sat by the window and looked towards the gate, but she had few possessions. Her husband allowed her freedom of movement within the courtyard, but kept her under surveillance. He invited guests and spoke of her as something he had forgiven. She stayed at home, he said. She paid. But there was something else in his words. He wanted his power to be felt. He wanted people to see that he could forgive a chief, but would not forgive a saint if he broke the rules. He wanted people to say, he punished the bishop. Weeks passed. The letters from the bishop, hidden by Maria, reached her hands on the rare days when she could be alone. He wrote few words. I think of you. Forgive me. I no longer know how to serve God. His handwriting was shaky. She read the letters and cried alone in her room. No one heard her. She hid the sheets of paper among her fabrics. But her heart was torn apart. Sometimes she whispered his name. And when someone came in, she pressed her hand to her chest and said she wasn't in pain. The feudal lord watched. He noticed that letters were coming and going. He did not show it at first, but one evening, when he returned home, a maid handed him a bundle. He unfolded it and saw a piece of paper with the bishop's handwriting. His face did not change. He folded the letter and put it in a box. At night, he opened it again and began to read aloud. The words were simple, but they revealed the depth of his feelings. He quietly dropped the letter on the floor and said in the darkness, he thinks love will save him. He began to change his plan. Official disgrace was not enough. He wanted the bishop's name to be spoken as a warning. He summoned several people who controlled the courts and prisons and said, you know how people forget. I want no one to forget this lesson. They exchanged glances. One of them said, we can add punishment outside the law, outside the court. People will remember. The feudal lord nodded. One night, the bishop's cell was surrounded by people, not guards, but mercenaries who acted on secret signals. They came quietly and led him away in handcuffs. The bishop did not resist. He thought he would meet Mary's husband again, that they would ask him about her fate. He was brought to the feudal lord's hall, which was empty and where he felt the coldness of power. The feudal lord stood with his arms folded and spoke calmly. You must understand that you have hurt the house. You know what it means to be punished publicly. But that is not enough. You say you repent. Prove it. Prove that your voice is now silence. What do you want? Asked the bishop. His voice was weak. I want people to see you not as a saint, but as a man who pays for his words, replied the feudal lord. You will walk through the villages. You will ask forgiveness from those you have harmed. You will be in plain sight. And I want you to do it in such a way that no one can forget. The bishop could not argue. He thought of Maria and how her life was connected to his. He thought about how her face would become a shadow if he did not agree. He agreed. He was dressed in simple clothes, and a sign was hung around his neck with the word hypocrite written on it. He was taken out onto the roads. People recognized him, recognized the voice that had once sounded from the pulpit, and now heard it from the mouth of a man who was asking for forgiveness. Their reactions varied. Some spat, some passed by in silence, some listened and sighed. The journey lasted weeks. He walked through towns and villages saying, I have sinned. His injuries were not physical, but they were in his face, in his ability to speak loudly and confidently. He became a quiet man, and that was his punishment. But the feudal lord wanted more. He wanted the bishop to lose what made him dangerous. He wanted to make the bishop's words empty. And the message that came from the feudal lord's court was clear. No one should consider themselves above the order of the house. The bishop walked slowly along the road. His shoes were worn out, his hands still remembered the sign around his neck and the looks on people's faces. He thought about how inexorably destinies change. Before he was invited into people's homes, now they avoided him. He thought about Maria and how somewhere out there, in her home, her life was flowing according to his decision. He thought about the feudal lord's words, about how he had spoken of order. And he thought about how he had not seen Maria for a long time. One evening before his departure, the feudal lord summoned the bishop to his reception room. The room was empty, the candles burned dimly. The feudal lord looked him straight in the face. You have come a long way, he said calmly. You have asked people for forgiveness. You have shown everyone that you are repentant. People bow their heads. But I want your grief to be sincere. I want you to leave a clear mark behind you. You will go where people remember. And when you ask for forgiveness, remember that you will be listened to not as a priest, but as a man." The bishop nodded. His voice trembled. "I will do whatever you command. I will do everything to ensure that Maria does not suffer." "Good," said the feudal lord. "Then go." The bishop left. He understood that the feudal lord's words contained both a promise and a threat. He set off on the road again, but a chill settled in his chest. Meanwhile, Maria lived in a house where everything was in plain sight. She was seated at the table and brought food, but no one looked her in the eye. She wrote letters, hid them in her hem, and knew that her husband read them. She asked for only one thing, that the bishop be alive. She did not ask for freedom, did not ask to return to her former life. She wanted the one who had changed her days to remain alive somewhere nearby, so that she would know that he existed. Sometimes she would go to the window at night and look at the gate. Once late at night, a servant approached her and said quietly, "Madam, the bishop has returned. He has asked for a meeting." She did not answer immediately. She sat down and hesitated. Then she got up and walked across the corridor. She froze at the door. He stood in the doorway, wearing a simple cloak, his face pale. They looked at each other and suddenly realized that words were unnecessary. "You've come," she said so quietly that the servants behind the wall couldn't hear. He came over and took her hand. She didn't pull away. He gave her the letter he had been carrying. "I thought about you every day," he said. "I thought about how to heal the pain. But nothing works." "I know," she replied. "I hid your letters. I read them and thought that if we left, everything would be different." They spoke in whispers briefly. They made no plans. They just wanted to be together. One evening, Maria said, "I can leave. I know the way to the old craftsman's cemetery. There's an abandoned house there. We can run away at night." The bishop replied slowly, "If we leave, you will lose everything. Your name, your home, what's left of your life. I don't know if we can endure it. But if you want to, I'm with you." They decided to flee. The night was chosen quietly, without cries or witnesses. Maria changed into a simple dress. The servants thought she was going to see a saint. The bishop left with her through a side passage. They walked quickly, not looking back, holding hands. Their hearts were pounding. They thought about a new beginning, about how they would rebuild their lives. They thought about humility and that luck might be on their side. But the feudal lord knew everything. He watched the door as the two figures disappeared into the darkness. He did not raise his voice. He stood up and said quietly, "Bring them back." He called those who could do it without making a sound. "Let this be a lesson to everyone," he said. The bishop and Maria were walking along the main road. Suddenly, people in cloaks approached them. The man who held the rope and had a cold gaze leaned towards them. "Stop," he said. The bishop felt something sink inside him. He realized that this was not just an arrest. Maria grabbed the bishop's hand and whispered, "Run." "I can't," he whispered. "You must go." They led them into the castle, where people had already gathered. The feudal lord stood on his throne, his face calm. In the hall were people who had previously come for blessings and advice. The feudal lord stood up and said loudly, "You left. You hoped to escape. But that is impossible. You will not leave like this." He pointed at the bishop. "He betrayed his office. He betrayed us. You must see the price of betrayal." He stood up and gave a sign. Two guards grabbed the bishop and led him to the middle of the hall. Maria cried out, "No," and rushed forward. The guards held her back. She struggled and called his name. The bishop looked at her and said calmly, "Go away. I don't want you to see this." The feudal lord approached them and said quietly, "I didn't want this. But you chose it. You thought that love would justify everything. Listen to everyone. Let this be a lesson." The bishop was ordered to remove his remaining clothes, put on a sign and kneel down. People watched. Maria struggled at the bars, calling his name, crying and scratching her hands. She screamed to be let go. She begged the people for forgiveness and begged her husband. The feudal lord looked at her and suddenly shook his head. "Enough," he said quietly. and there was no regret in his voice. She tried to run away. She broke the rules. The house of mercy awaits her. Let her live out the rest of her days there, and remember that it is not worth abandoning her role. The bishop fell silent. He thought about how Maria would remain within walls that would suffocate her. He thought that his words would change nothing. He thought about how it had all begun so simply, with a glance, with a touch. When the sentence was carried out and the bishop was left in chains in the square, Maria was taken to a house of mercy on the outskirts of the city. He watched the carriage drive away and saw in its departure the end of his hope. He tried to shout, but his voice faltered. People dispersed, some saying that everything was fair. Others thought differently. But the feudal lord remained standing at the gate and did not leave with the crowd. He watched the departing carriage and closed his eyes. She was accepted into the charity house without further ado. She was settled in a small room. At first, they brought her food and water. Then they paid less attention to her. She sat by the window and wrote letters that no one received. Sometimes she talked to the women who had been there before her. They were silent and exchanged glances. She began to lose weight. Her voice was fading. She tried to worry less so as not to attract attention. But one day, when she woke up, she realized she couldn't take it anymore. She wrote a short letter and put it under her pillow. The letter contained one sentence: "Forgive me." Then she took out the small knife she always carried when she felt hopeless and went into the garden. They found her in the morning. She was lying under a tree, her hands folded on her chest. Her face was peaceful. No one said anything about it that day. Rumors began to circulate later. They said she had died of grief. They talked about the woman's weakness. No one told the truth as it should have been told. The bishop learned of Maria's death from a short note that arrived late at night at the monastery where he had been taken. He sat in his cell and read the lines, then put the letter down and said nothing. He got up and went to the door. The guards let him through. He wanted to see her one more time, but he knew it was impossible. He went to a hill outside the city and sat down, placing his hands on his knees. He took off his clothes and said a final prayer for her. His voice was quiet and broken. After a few days, he stopped eating. His words became short. He asked for forgiveness from God and from those he had hurt. He was asked if he wanted priestly assistance. He shook his head quietly. "I must go my own way," he said. The old brother who sometimes came to visit accepted his silence. The bishop closed his eyes and never opened them again. Soon his body was found in his cell. The feudal lord held a memorial service and spoke beautiful words about order and justice. He spoke of goodness and the importance of obeying the law. People nodded. But when the candles went out and night fell, there were empty seats in the house. The whirlwind of gossip died down. Life went on as usual. But those who knew the truth, those who had seen how it all began and how it all ended, were left with a void. No one could say for sure who was more to blame. Those who broke their vows, those who responded with gestures of authority, or those who watched in silence and did nothing. The story ended not with words, but with silence in the empty rooms where people who loved and suffered once lived.